Hello, everyone, and welcome back. If you've ever tried to do a low FODMAP diet as a vegetarian, you've probably had that moment where you look at the food list and think, what is even left to eat? Because a lot of the foods you normally rely on, like beans, lentils, certain vegetables, are suddenly the exact things you're being told to avoid. And at the same time, you're trying to still eat enough protein, have meals that actually feel filling and not just live on rice and eggs. And what I see happen a lot is people really try to do this well. They're reading labels, looking things up, making swaps, and either they're just not feeling that much better, or they feel a little better during elimination, but then everything falls apart once they try to add foods back in. So then it starts to feel confusing, like, am I doing this wrong? Or is this just not working for me? And usually it's not that you're doing it wrong, it's that this approach is a lot more nuanced than it's often explained. So, what I want to do in this episode today is walk you through how to actually make a low FODMAP vegetarian diet work in real life. Not just what foods are okay or not, but how to structure your meals, where people tend to get stuck, and what to look at if you're doing everything right on paper, but still not getting the results you expected. Because what we're trying to do is not just keep cutting your diet down and cutting more and more foods out. We're aiming to calm things down in your system enough so that your symptoms improve. And then we can actually build your tolerance back up over time so your diet can expand again. So let's start with why this combination of vegetarian and low FODMAP can feel so restrictive in the first place. A big part of the challenge comes down to overlap. Many of the foods that are staples in the vegetarian diet, like beans, lentils, and certain high fiber plant foods, are also some of the most common high FODMAP triggers. So instead of just making a few adjustments, it can feel like you're completely overhauling your diet and removing the very foods that you rely on the most. On top of that, a lot of these foods are typically considered healthy. They're high in fiber, they're dense in nutrients, and they're often encouraged as part of a well-balanced vegetarian diet. But when your gut is more sensitive to fermentation, those same foods can start to work against you, especially when they're eaten in larger amounts or layered throughout the day. I see this come up all the time. I had a client, Rachel, who had already started trying to follow a lower FODMAP approach on her own while sticking with a vegetarian diet. She was building her meals around things like lentils, chickpeas, big salads, and roasted vegetables, trying to make it all fit into the day. On paper, it looked like she was doing everything right. She was choosing low FODMAP foods, but she was bloated pretty much all day. And by the afternoon, she felt so uncomfortable that she started avoiding social plans, and every adjustment she made seemed to make things worse instead of better. She had already tried to cut out a few obvious triggers, but because so many of her go to vegetarian foods were also higher in FODMAP, she kept running into the same issue in different ways. And at that point, she just felt stuck, and that's exactly where many people end up. So when you try to combine a vegetarian diet with a low FODMAP approach, it requires more than just swapping foods. It's about understanding how to structure this in a way that actually works for you. One of the biggest misconceptions about the low FODMAP diet is that foods fall into clean categories, that they're either allowed or they need to be avoided. And that's really not how this works. FODMAP tolerance is highly portion dependent. A food that's well tolerated in a smaller amount can become much more likely to trigger symptoms once that portion increases. This is a big part of why you'll sometimes see what look like conflicts between two different FODMAP lists. This is a huge frustration I hear from people. All the information out there conflicts. And in many cases, it's not that one list is right and another one is wrong. It may be that they're referencing different portion sizes. There's so many different foods out there, and there's so much minutia when it comes to portion sizes. And if you try to distill it down into a 1 or 2 page PDF where you have a list of good foods and a list of bad foods, you're going to oversimplify things. And different creators of content might have different ways that they're organizing it, and so it can end up looking conflicting. So that's one thing we see is that portion sizes are oversimplified or maybe not even addressed at all. And that's one of the reasons people can feel like they're following a list but still not improving. And it's also not just about individual foods, it's about how those foods are combined and layered. So you might be technically choosing low FODMAP foods, but if you're stacking several moderate FODMAP foods in the same meal or even across the day, it can still add up over time and trigger symptoms. This is especially common with the vegetarian diet, where meals often rely on multiple plant-based ingredients that each contribute a small amount. Timing also plays a role. Eating these foods close together throughout the day doesn't always give your system much of a break. So, even if each choice looks safe on its own, the overall load can still be enough to create symptoms. And that is why one of the other reasons the low FODMAP diet can feel inconsistent, like you're doing the same thing one day and the next day it gives you different results. So we need to keep in mind the low FODMAP diet is a tool to reduce the load on your system. But if you don't understand how portion sizes, layering, and your individual tolerance all fit together, it can end up feeling unpredictable. And that's where people tend to get really frustrated. So, how do we actually do a low FODMAP vegetarian diet? Most people approach this by trying to follow the food lists as closely as possible. And what we also want to do on top of that, though, what lists technically don't usually tell you is how to build meals in a way that works. So instead of thinking in terms of what to remove, it's much more helpful to think in terms of how to structure your meals so that they're balanced, satisfying, and less likely to trigger symptoms. So here is the framework we use at Nutrition Resolution. We're a group of GI focused dietitians, and we use the following framework. Number one, start with your protein. This is the hardest part on a vegetarian low FODMAP approach, and it's usually where things start to fall apart. If your protein intake is too low, or if it's coming mostly from higher FODMAP sources like large servings of legumes, it can make symptoms worse and leave you feeling unsatisfied. So you want to start with your protein, and then you build in your lower FODMAP carbohydrates, and that would be things like rice, oats, quinoa, and potatoes tend to be the best tolerated, and they give your body a reliable source of energy without adding a lot of fermentable load. From there, we want to add vegetables, but be intentional. This is where portion sizes and variety really matter. Instead of loading up on large amounts of one or two foods, it often works better to include smaller portions of a few different low FODMAP vegetables. And then you want to round out your meal with fats, and that would be olive oil, butter, ghee, nuts, or seeds, because they can help with satiety and make meals feel more complete without contributing to the FODMAP load in the same way. Nuts and seeds in small amounts are tolerated. And when you build meals this way, you're not just randomly choosing from the allowed food list, you're actually creating structure. And that structure is what helps reduce symptoms without over restricting. So this stays sustainable and actually gives you useful feedback about what your body tolerates. And that is our goal with this, not to make your diet smaller and smaller and whittle your food list down to 5 foods or 2 foods, but we want to make it work better for you. Now, I did lay this out more concretely. I put together a full guide that includes a complete food list with portion guidance, plus a 7-day vegetarian low FODMAP meal plan with a grocery list with everything in the amounts that you need for that week. And it includes simple recipes that you can actually put into practice. So check out that in the show notes. It will give you a jump start on all this. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about vegetarian protein, because this really is the real challenge when you're trying to do a low FODMAP diet as a vegetarian. Most vegetarian protein sources, especially the ones people tend to rely on the most, are also higher in FODMAPs. So it can start to feel like you're stuck choosing between getting enough protein and keeping your symptoms under control. What tends to work best are more straightforward options. Eggs are usually very well tolerated. Firm and extra firm tofu tend to be much easier on the gut than softer forms. Lactose-free milk, hard cheeses, and lactose-free yogurt can also be really helpful ways to get protein in without adding much fermentable load. Most plant-based milks and yogurts can fit from a FODMAP standpoint, but they're not typically going to have very much protein. So they don't always function the same way nutritionally as cow's milk and yogurt. So keep that in mind. You can use plant-based milks and yogurt, but I would not count them toward your protein. Then there are other foods like lentils and chickpeas. Now, these fall in the middle. They're not necessarily off limits, but they tend to be much more portion dependent. Smaller amounts, especially if you use the canned and well rinsed version. Well, you use the canned and then you rinse them in a colander after you pour them out of the can. They're often tolerated better than larger servings where they're just made from their dried form. And this is where it can get frustrating because it's not just about the food itself, it's also about the amount and how it's being combined and your individual tolerance. So even foods that are technically allowed can still cause symptoms if the portion or overall load isn't right. Next, there are plant-based meat alternatives, but these can be hit or miss. So this would be like texturized soy protein products, like your plant meats, your vegetarian sausages, vegetarian bacon, and veggie burgers, and those types of things. They can often contain added fibers, added gums, or just other ingredients that can increase bloating, even if they look like they would be a convenient solution on the surface. I had another client, Maya, who felt like she just could not win at this. Every time she tried to include lentils or chickpeas, even in what she thought were reasonable portions, she would end up bloated and uncomfortable. So she just cut them out altogether. Over time, her meals became more carb heavy and just lower in protein. She started noticing her energy was dropping and she just never felt satisfied after eating. So she found herself snacking more throughout the day. And she really felt like she was stuck between controlling her symptoms by doing that, not getting enough nutrition. And what ended up helping was not cutting out more foods, it was getting more specific. We adjusted her portions, we changed how her meals were structured, we focused on protein sources that were more consistently tolerated for her. And once we were able to dial that structure in, starting with protein, everything started to feel a lot more stable. And that's the nuance here. It's not just about finding vegetarian protein sources, it's about finding the ones and the amounts that your body can actually handle right now. So let's get deeper into specifics here. We've talked about the structure. Let's talk about the actual foods. And I'm not going to give you an extensive list here because I would just be spending the next 20 minutes listing off foods. That could get a little boring. I do have a full list in the downloadable guide of the foods that would be suitable, and then the foods to limit, and then the foods that would be better avoided in the FODMAP elimination phase. That's vegetarian. But let's just go through some of them right now to give you an idea. And you guys, this information is up to date as of Monash. They did some updates to their research and therefore to their app last year. And this information is up to date as of April 2026. Okay. And just so you know, the other frustrating part about it is that the FODMAP information does tend to evolve over time as research improves. So foods that we considered low FODMAP 5 years ago or high FODMAP 5 years ago or even 2 years ago are now totally different. So that's a little hard for some of us to wrap our mind around and swallow because we're used to things being a certain way. And because portion size matters here, what I've listed in this food to choose often list, these are foods where, yes, there might be a limit, but the limit is much higher than anyone would ever eat typically. So you can pretty much eat them freely. And then in the foods to limit, that's where you could easily, maybe in a typical portion, go over what the limit is. So that's where I'll list those foods that you do need to stick to a certain portion. And then the foods to avoid are where the portion limit is so ridiculous that why even bother with that food? If it were, this is a made up example, but if it were something like 2 blueberries, nobody's going to sit down and eat that much. So that food would be off the list. So let's talk about foods to choose often where either there's literally no limit to the amount that can be eaten and keep it low FODMAP, or the limit is so high that you would just never eat that much. So you're pretty safe eating typical or either on the large end of typical portions. So some of the vegetables would be things like zucchini, carrots, spinach, bell peppers, cucumbers, and eggplant. Some of the fruits are actually blueberries, oranges, kiwi, and pineapple. So my made up example before was a bad one because blueberries you can actually eat freely. Grains and starches would be white rice, brown rice, oats. That's a new one because oats used to be considered limited, but the most up-to-date research says oats are free. Quinoa and potatoes. Protein, eggs, edamame, firm and extra firm tofu, tempeh, lactose-free dairy, and hard cheeses. And we separate those two because hard cheeses, they're naturally very low in lactose and they give you a lot of protein. Nuts and seeds, pecans, macadamia nuts, pumpkin seeds, and chia seeds. Fats, olive oil, butter, and ghee. Flavorings, garlic infused olive oil, just about any herb except for onion and garlic powder, spices, and citrus. Now, again, that is not an exhaustive list. I have a much more comprehensive list in the downloadable guide. Let me give you a few examples of the limited portion items. That is things like avocado, canned lentils, canned chickpeas, certain fruits like banana, like a ripe banana. The FODMAP content is different if we're talking about a ripe versus a more on the green side banana. So a ripe banana, you'd want to limit the portion. Strawberries, raspberries, and certain vegetables like broccoli, cucumber, kale. Those, by the way, used to be considered unlimited. Now we know there's a limit. The actual portion sizes are all detailed in the accompanying guide. So anything that needs to be limited, I tell you exactly what portion to limit it to. And then foods to avoid. Again, these are foods where even a small portion would be significant in FODMAP. So that would be vegetables like onion, garlic, and mushrooms, fruits like apples, pears, mango, and watermelon, legumes in larger servings, or legumes that are made straight from the dried form and not canned. When you can legumes, or beans, the FODMAP, the GOS leaches into the water. Some of it does. So when you drain them and rinse them, it decreases the FODMAP content. But if you just make them from scratch and you don't can them, then you get the full FODMAP content. So it would be most beans that aren't canned. Grains would be wheat-based grains. So a simple way to think of it's not technically the gluten that is the FODMAP, but a simple way to think about it is the gluten containing grains are the ones that are high FODMAP. Technically, with wheat, I will say small amounts are allowed. So I was a little torn as to whether to consider these limited or avoid, because you can actually have one slice of wheat bread, regular wheat bread with gluten, or a half cup of regular pasta, and it's low FODMAP. But I ended up deciding to put it in the foods to avoid list because I think most people would typically have maybe 2 slices of bread for a sandwich and maybe more than a half cup of pasta, right? So be careful with that one. All right. Now let's talk about what do you do if the low FODMAP diet just is not fully working for you? This is actually one of the reasons I got deeper into functional nutrition and why I decided to go beyond just working with elimination diets to help people with their digestive issues and going deeper into functional nutrition, because I was dealing with a lot of diets like the low FODMAP or different elimination diets, depending on the type of condition the person was dealing with, could be very effective for certain patients. But there's other people where, you're following the diet carefully, you've cut out the high FODMAP foods, you're doing everything right, and yet the symptoms are still there, or maybe they only partially improved. And that's where you start to wonder, okay, what am I missing? Am I doing it wrong? And the thing is, the low FODMAP diet can be helpful for reducing symptoms because it lowers the amount of fermentable material your gut has to deal with. But it doesn't address why your system is reacting so strongly to those foods in the first place. And in some cases, it's just not enough on its own. So that's where we have to zoom out. And there are a few common areas that tend to play a role here. Number one is motility, or how well things are moving through your digestive tract. That can make a big difference. So if things are moving just more slowly than they should, the food has more time, the FODMAPs have more time to sit there and ferment. So that can make symptoms worse. The next thing is digestion. If you're not breaking your food down well with digestive enzymes, with stomach acid, with bile, then food, including FODMAPs, is more likely to reach further down in the gut in a form that's still very intact, that feeds microbes and drives more fermentation. We also look at things like, is there bacterial overgrowth, like SIBO, in the overall gut environment? Because if you have bacterial overgrowth, then you have these organisms that are over fermenting even small amounts of food. So these are the pieces that tend to explain why someone is having FODMAP reactions in the first place. And once we address them and resolve them, your FODMAP tolerance improves. So then not only are you able to get better results on the low FODMAP diet, but you're able to actually complete the process through into the reintroduction phase where you're able to successfully reintroduce foods without them triggering symptoms. I'll tell you about another client. I had Lauren who came in after trying a low FODMAP diet on her own for a couple of months. She'd been extremely strict. She was avoiding anything she thought might be a trigger, double checking labels, sticking closely to her food list, but she was still bloated every day. She told me she felt frustrated more than anything because she put in so much effort and she just wasn't seeing the results. And at that point, she was pretty much ready to give up on the diet. When we looked more closely, it wasn't that she needed to cut out more foods. It was that there were underlying factors we hadn't identified or addressed yet. We found that she had an overgrowth of methanogenic organisms, which is often referred to as methane SIBO or EMO, which had slowed her motility and was making her much more sensitive to even small amounts of FODMAPs. So even though she was technically following a low FODMAP approach, it just wasn't enough. And this is something we see a lot with methane overgrowth, is that even the small amounts of FODMAPs are so rapidly fermented into hydrogen, which feeds the methane producing organisms. And so the low FODMAP diet alone often doesn't help with those symptoms. So if you're experiencing that picture of constipation, bloating, maybe even upper GI symptoms like GERD, and you're not responding to the low FODMAP diet, methane overgrowth might be a part of what is going on with you. And I would recommend getting properly tested and evaluated for it to confirm before deciding on that. But in this case, even small amounts of carbohydrates for Lauren were being rapidly fermented in her gut because her motility was slower. Everything was just sitting there longer, and it was basically creating a perfect storm for that bloating. And what we have to do is fully clear that methane overgrowth. And then we see that the food tolerance improves. Once we're able to knock those microbe levels down enough, then you're able to eat those FODMAPs without having those symptoms again. And methane overgrowth is not the only reason this can happen. There are other cases where we might see different types of bacterial overgrowth. It could be something like hydrogen sulfide. And when you have an overgrowth of bacteria creating hydrogen sulfide gas, that's where the issue is not really about FODMAPs per se. It's also about sulfur containing foods. So that's another thing we see when the low FODMAP diet may not be helping. Maybe you have a hydrogen sulfide pattern where the low FODMAP fermentable carbohydrates are not really the right foods to be restricting. because the low sulfur foods, many of them are still included on the low FODMAP diet. And so you could be following it very closely and still not feeling better. We also see issues with digestion. So if your digestive enzyme output is low, or if you have pancreatic insufficiency where food isn't being broken down properly, symptoms can look very similar on the surface. They can be the typical IBS symptoms, but the approach needs to shift to supporting digestion better, not just cutting out more foods. And that's why a food only approach doesn't always get somebody all the way there because the underlying driver isn't always the same from person to person. The symptoms can look the same, but the underlying driver is not the same. Our guts are like a fingerprint. We're all a little different. And in practice, this usually shows up in one of two ways. Either somebody follows the diet and doesn't see much improvement to begin with, or they do feel better during elimination, but as soon as they try to reintroduce foods, everything triggers symptoms again. And then they end up just stuck in the restricted phase. And both of these point to the same thing. There's something deeper going on that hasn't been addressed yet. So if you're in that place where you've tried adjusting your diet and you still feel stuck, this is usually where we need to look beyond just food. I actually do have a master class to walk you down the bigger picture of what's going on and how to start thinking about this in a more complete way. It's called Why Your Gut Still Isn't Better, the real reasons you feel stuck, and what to do about it. So I'm going to link to that as well in the show notes if this applies to you and you'd like to learn more about it. I remember just feeling so frustrated about this early in my career. I had people who were doing the elimination diet perfectly, the elimination phase of the low FODMAP diet perfectly, and either they just weren't improving at all, or they would feel better, but we just couldn't add anything back in. And they would say, I know I'm not supposed to stay in this elimination phase. I know I'm supposed to move past it and reintroduce FODMAPs, but this is the best I felt in years. And every time I try to reintroduce foods, my symptoms come right back. So what am I supposed to do? And we see people all the time that have been low FODMAP for years because you can tell them you're not supposed to stay in that phase, but if that's the only way they can leave their house without having diarrhea, what are you supposed to do? So that was the question I was getting from clients. And honestly, it was a fair question. And again, that's what pushed me to learn how to do this deeper work, to get advanced training in integrative and functional nutrition and start looking at what are those root causes and how can we actually solve them so that people's digestive function improves, their function improves, so that the only way you feel good is not by having to be highly restricted in your diet. That when you're having to restrict a ton of foods just to feel good and get through the day, you're just managing your situation. Hey, that's a legitimate place to be, but it's not getting all the way to the solution. So that's the bigger picture. The low FODMAP diet is a really useful tool for calming symptoms and creating a baseline, but it's not meant to be the final destination. We want to use it strategically, then build back tolerance so your diet can expand again, not stay limited long term. Now I want to tell you about some of the common mistakes I see. So watch out for these. A lot of the frustration with the low FODMAP vegetarian approach does not come from doing it wrong. It comes from a few really common patterns that aren't always obvious at first. Number one is eating large portions of safe foods. So just because a food is considered low FODMAP does not mean unlimited amounts will be well tolerated. And so this is where portion sizes and stacking matter. Larger servings, even of some of the right foods, can still create symptoms. So again, my guide details exactly what servings are allowed for those foods that should be limited in portions, and then which ones you can eat freely and which ones to avoid altogether. And I'll just say in general with this, if you're not sure, a good strategy is always to eat smaller amounts of more different kinds of foods versus a large portion of any one or two foods. The second common mistake is not getting enough protein. This is one of the biggest issues we have with vegetarian diets, especially on a low FODMAP approach, because when protein sources feel limited or unpredictable, meals can become very carb heavy, which often leads to more hunger, lower energy, and less stable symptom control overall. We also see over restricting unnecessarily. This is a huge one because it's really easy to start cutting more and more foods in an effort to feel better. But beyond a certain point, this usually backfires, making the diet harder to sustain and not necessarily improving symptoms. We also see people not spacing meals far enough away from each other and eating too frequently, especially when meals include fermentable foods, doesn't always give your system enough time to move things through. And that can contribute to more buildup and discomfort over the course of the day. So we often recommend spacing meals about 3 to 4 hours apart. That works better to support motility and reduce that constant buildup. And then the last common mistake is very common as well. That's assuming that food is the only issue. We look at food as the problem because we notice that cause and effect. We eat the food and we feel the symptoms. So it's natural to think the food is the problem. Now, food does play a role, but it's not the whole picture. If symptoms are not improving or if only improving to a point, it's usually a sign that something else needs to be addressed alongside the diet. And we talked about those things a bit earlier. If this has felt confusing or restrictive, that makes sense. Trying to combine a vegetarian diet with a low FODMAP approach is not always straightforward, especially when you're relying on a lot of the very foods that tend to be more fermentable. But this is doable, where the goal is not to keep cutting foods out or stay in a highly restricted phase long term. It's to use the low FODMAP approach as a starting point to calm symptoms, create some stability, and then build from there. That means figuring out what your body can tolerate right now, structuring your meals in a way that actually works, and addressing anything underlying that might be making your system more sensitive in the first place. Because in the end, we don't want to shrink down our list of safe foods. It's being able to eat a wide range of foods again without constantly worrying about how we're going to feel afterward. That's what we're after. Low FODMAP is a great starting point, but it's not the finish line. And if you've been trying to figure this out on your own and you still feel stuck, or if you're only seeing partial improvement, it's usually a sign that there's more going on than just the food itself. And we do take a personalized approach at Nutrition Resolution. We look at what's actually driving your symptoms, things like motility, digestion, microbial balance, and the overall gut environment. So you're not just managing symptoms, you're actually moving toward being able to tolerate more foods again. So if that sounds like the type of support you're looking for, feel free to schedule a strategy call with me. We'll talk through what's been going on, decide if it makes sense to work together, and then we can outline what a plan of work would look like for you. And I'll put the link to schedule the strategy call in the show notes as well. We've talked about all the things that can go wrong here, but if you've gotten to the point where you are feeling better and you're starting to think about reintroducing foods back in, I also have a FODMAP reintroduction guide that I will link in the show notes on how to approach the FODMAP reintroduction in a way that actually gives you useful information, where you'll be able to tell, am I tolerating these foods? What's the process for reintroducing foods once I am feeling better on the elimination diet, and be able to tell if you're tolerating them or not without triggering severe symptoms. So I have a guide walking you through that process. It's free. You can download it from the show notes. And that way you can use the reintroductions to give you useful information, either to expand your diet without triggering severe symptoms or to determine if your system's just super sensitive and maybe you need some deeper support. The guide is not specific to vegetarian diets, but the process still applies in the same way.